my name is Nicola Barsdorf. I am currently the Director for the Office of Research Integrity and Ethics at Stellenbosch. And today I'm going to be providing a brief overview of research integrity and ethics at Stellenbosch University, and then we'll take a quick look at our current policies and structures. Is it moving to the next slide?
Yes, it is.
Okay, great. So just to outline what we'll talk about today, I'm going to start with what is research integrity and why it is important. And then we will take a look at what is research misconduct. And then after looking at some of the drivers of research misconduct, we'll look at how we can foster integrity in research. And then finally, the last few slides looking at Stellenbosch University's structures and policies and procedures that are in place that are relevant to research and integrity and ethics. So what is research integrity? And I always take it back to this slide looking at what is integrity, defined broadly as honesty or the quality of being honest and having strong moral principles. And integrity is often cited as the choice between doing what's convenient and what's right. And if you look at then the definition of research integrity, what is research integrity? Well, it's doing what's right while we conduct research. So active adherence to the ethical principles and those professional standards that are essential for doing research responsibly. So some of those ethical principles and professional standards include honesty, responsibility, being trustworthy, fair, accountable, and having a high regard for the scientific record or the outputs or documentation of your science. And if we look at responsible conduct of research, you can sort of broadly divide it into research ethics and research integrity, just for simplicity. When we look at research ethics, we're largely talking about the ethical design of the protocol. So thoughtful application of research ethics principles and compliance with local and international laws and regulations and guidelines while you in the design of your protocol and in the carry out of that protocol. And generally, this is protocols are subjected to research ethics committee review, and the research ethics committee becomes the body that helps to support researchers to make sure they are complying with those guidelines and making sure that those ethical principles are present in their research plan. Research integrity, on the other hand, it talks to the moral conduct of the investigator. So it's much more about individual behavior. Is the researcher being morally sensitive? Do they have virtuous behavior? Are they honest, responsible, trustworthy, fair, accountable, etc.? And is the researcher adhering to a high professional standard? And at the moment in academia, this is generally checked through peer review. So why is research integrity important? Why do we focus on this in research? And if you attended Lex Botha's lecture last week, he also focused a lot on this idea of trust, because we know that research integrity is the basis for researchers' trust in each other. If we know that other researchers are conducting responsible research with research integrity, we know we can trust their research. We can trust their research record. And it also spills over into society's trust in research evidence and expertise. And we've seen, during the COVID era, an erosion of society's trust in some of the science. But this is why research integrity is important, so that we can trust each other, we can trust those outputs and publications that go into the academic space, and so that society can maintain its trust for the work that we do. And trust in research is generally earned by being transparent, so allowing others to see how you are working and what you are doing. And then also, obviously, performing research that's relevant, socially relevant, that's ethically sound, and that's of a high quality. And if we start to see sloppy research or questionable research practices, those can then undermine trust. But more importantly, I think they end up also distorting the evidence base, and we'll talk a bit more about that, how that happens now. So you might remember back in 2021, there was a big uproar and quite a few scientists quit the journal board of the journal Vaccines protesting a grossly irresponsible study claiming that COVID-19 vaccines kill. And there were several respected virologists and vaccinologists that resigned as editors of the journal to protest the publication because they believed that data was misused. To conclude that for 3 deaths prevented by the vaccine, we had to accept 2 inflicted by the vaccine. And the data was misused because it made the assumption, the very incorrect assumption, that all deaths occurring after the vaccination were caused by the vaccination. And this sort of spilled over and was then being used by anti-vaxxers and COVID-19 deniers as evidence that the COVID vaccines are not safe. And it's really, I guess, an example of the short term being garbage in, garbage out. So if you are misusing data or manipulating data or misreading data, then the publication or the finding that gets produced is also going to be misleading. And historically, I think we've seen how questionable research practices can distort the evidence base. And they've, historically even affected public buy-in and public opinion on important public health interventions like vaccines. So you may also remember the Wakefield article that linked the MMR vaccine and autism that was published in the 90s and has since been discredited. It was, the BMJ published an article that article was fraudulent. Nature's published on the discredited doctor. But what ended up happening was over the last few decades, there was a buy-in to this discredited research. And that affected public opinion and buy-in for vaccinations. And so the question is, how does this happen? And I think The Economist captures it really well in this article from 2021, where they say that dubious research haunts the academic literature long after retractions. So they named it zombie research and said the zombie research haunts the academic literature long after its supposed demise. But essentially, the problem with dubious research is that even in the cases where it's identified and those publications are then retracted, they somehow continue to be cited in the academic literature long after the retraction. So as academics, we're not doing a good enough job of checking, has this article been retracted because it was found to be fraudulent or dubious in some way? And should we be citing it in our research to support the evidence base? And how it ends up distorting the integrity of the evidence base is nicely depicted in this diagram that came out of the Economist article. So if you look at the diagram, the top bar is papers that were retracted because of errors. And you can see it dates back to the 1970s, and that timeline runs right up till 2015. The middle bar is the number of citations of those retracted papers. Despite the fact that they were retracted, there were still academics citing them. And then the bottom bar is citations of papers that cited the original retracted papers. So you can see the sort of exponential growth of citations of dubious research. And the most shocking figure that stands out in this page is the 658,000 citations of a paper retracted somewhere back in the 1970s or 80s. And you can see if we've now got a huge body of evidence and multiple citations for a piece of dubious research, this starts to distort the evidence base. And scientists are more and more sort of citing a piece of research that shouldn't be out there. And we know the whole point of research and disseminating research findings is because we want to accumulate evidence that's eventually going to inform decision-making and practice. It will also influence policy and government spending in some cases, and it will definitely determine future lines of research and where researchers and academics see the value of pursuing something further or pursuing something related. So if dubious research distorts the integrity of the evidence base, it can also end up misinforming policy, government spending, and the direction of future research. And we can see how this is highly problematic. So what is research misconduct? What are these activities that distort research? Strictly speaking, research misconduct has been defined as fabrication, falsification, and plagiarism, either in proposing, performing, or reviewing research, or in reporting research results. And what fabrication is essentially, faking data or faking results. So making up data or results and recording or reporting them as if they are real. Falsification is often referred to as cooking the data. And we can see our chef on the left cooking up those research results. And this means, the research is actually conducted, but those research materials or the processes or the equipment or data are manipulated. And the researcher then changes or omits data or results without scientific justification. And so the results essentially become falsified. And then lastly, the P for plagiarism is essentially the use of one's own or someone else's work without adequate reference to the source. And if we look at research conduct in general, we can see it on a spectrum. And so this research misconduct, the fabrication, falsification, or plagiarism is at the one end of the spectrum or this continuum. And at the other end of the spectrum is responsible conduct of research. So those researchers that are now actively adhering to ethical principles and professional standards. But in the middle here, there's a pretty large range of what we can call questionable research practices. So they're not quite research misconduct, they're not fabrication, falsification, or plagiarism, but they're also not representative of the responsible conduct of research. And the reality is that these shady or questionable research practices are not uncommon. So I've just picked two studies that are more recent, one from 2009 that looked at how many scientists fabricate and falsify research, and then one from 2021, which looked at the prevalence of questionable research practices and research misconduct in the Netherlands. And from these studies, it looks like, well, this research misconduct or fabrication, falsification, and plagiarism is really, the prevalence of this is relatively low at 2 to 14%. When it comes to questionable research practices, we're looking at 33 to 50%. And this is on self-reported shady research practices. So we can imagine that the number might be, somewhat higher. I mean, this translates roughly into 1 in 3 scientists admitting to using questionable research practices. And we can see that then, this is not a small, inconsequential problem. So what are these questionable research practices that are not quite research misconduct, but that are not responsible research? And I've named, a few here. So, poor data management, for example. Poor mentorship and supervision would also fall into this category. Salami slicing publications, not managing conflicts of interest, sloppy science in general, also improper allocation of authorship, and then in general, in any case, a failure to follow accepted research procedures. And I guess the question is, what drives this? So, nothing. Obviously, research misconduct is not okay, and we're not saying it's okay, but it is helpful to look at what the drivers of research misconduct are in order to try and address them or at least minimize them. And in this diagram, we see some quotes from people who admitted to research misconduct in closed Office of Research Integrity cases at the NIH. And you can see there really are a variety of drivers. So poor supervision comes out quite strongly, inadequate training, competitive pressures or perverse incentives, which we'll talk about a bit later, personal circumstances, and obviously individual psychology. So the drivers can be a range. And what I've done in this slide is to try and capture in the 5 articles that are cited at the bottom what some of the main drivers of research misconduct are as published in the literature. And you will see the bolded ones, the career and funding pressures, perverse incentives, and poor mentoring and supervision were those drivers that have shown to have the strongest influence on research misconduct. And where as individual academics, but also as institutions, we need to focus our attention on those to try and start minimizing their influence. You can see I've grouped them quite specifically. The ones on the drivers on the right are really about the virtuousness of an individual, right? So some drivers are personal circumstance, individual psychology, perhaps the behavior is part of a larger pattern of social deviance, or an inability to manage those personal conflicts of interest. And in many cases, the driver is just the perception that the person's not going to get caught. So, you know, if you think there's a low probability of being detected, then you're going to go for it. And then on the left, we have factors which I think can be broadly classed as drivers that are part of the research climate of an institution. So these career and funding pressures and incentives, or institutional failures of oversight, inadequate training, poor mentoring and supervision, are all drivers that are as a result of the research climate. And so, you know, none of these operate individually. It's probably a very messy mix of both, but this helps us when we look at it to understand the drivers and where we need to direct intervention. I'm going to focus a bit on perverse incentives, because this is one of the drivers I think that we live with as academics in the South African environment. We have publication subsidies. And in 2019, David Heading published an article where he said payouts push professors towards predatory journals. And if South Africa truly wants to encourage good research, it must stop paying academics by the paper. Obviously, this is a highly controversial issue because we're all very used to operating in this incentivized environment. But the publication argues that these subsidies corrode the quality of scholarship in South Africa, that they discourage collaboration, and that they promote several other counterproductive practices like salami slicing or targeting low-quality journals that are deemed less demanding. If we try to look at perverse incentives, you know, from an ethical perspective, and just think through it logically, it makes sense, right? So pay per publication is a strong behavioral incentive, and it does motivate us. But we also know that all incentives can and will be gamed if the stakes are high. So we know that incentives work well for both intended effects, and in this case, it does work well to produce more publications. But these incentives also work well for unintended effects. So researchers will then tend to focus on quantity rather than quality. We see more cases of plagiarism and duplicate publication. We see more salami slicing, gift authorship, and the use of predatory journals, and generally less of a commitment to the time-consuming responsible research practices. The bottom line is that essentially these incentives matter, and we need to try and avoid the unintended effects. How we do that, no one has quite figured out yet, but we heard in Lex Boter's lecture last week a strong motivation to get rid of this incentive system because it is shown in the evidence to drive irresponsible research behavior. I mean, these incentives also apply to the rules for the appointment of professors and tenure tracks. So, you know, they bring to the fore this question of how do we assess a researcher? How should we assess a researcher for career advancement? And should it only be based on the numbers, or should we be using some other more qualitative assessment of quality and contribution? So keeping in mind the drivers that we've just outlined, how can we foster integrity in research? And I think, you know, if we look at that table that that divided them broadly, we've got to think about how to foster integrity as individual researchers, but we've also got to think about how to foster integrity as research institutions, as funders, and as journal editors. And I think I'll go through now just a couple of broad categories that have shown through evidence to foster integrity in research, or that have shown to be the building blocks for researchers to foster integrity in research. And obviously the first is some kind of familiarity with codes and guidelines in ethics and integrity. And I'll spend just one slide each on some of the more important guidelines that would be relevant to researchers in South Africa. And which we use at Stellenbosch University and encourage researchers to adhere to. The first is the Singapore Statement, published in 2010 it came out of the World Conference on Research Integrity. And this statement has 4 principles and 14 professional responsibilities. It's a short one-pager, and it's worth integrating this into your research literature. The second is the Montreal Statement, also came out of the World Congress for Research Integrity in 2013. And this statement more specifically applies to research integrity and cross-boundary research collaborations. And it outlines both the responsibilities of individual academics, but also the responsibilities of institutional partners. And then in 2019, out of the World Conference on Research Integrity came the Hong Kong Principles. These were now trying to ensure that researchers are being recognized and rewarded for behaviors that strengthen research integrity and promote trustworthy research. So this was the first attempt, I guess, to try and move away from just counting the numbers of publications and rewarding researchers for those, but trying to find principles, and they outline 5 principles and they give implementation examples for each. And then in 2020, the Global Code of Conduct was published, and Stellenbosch University formally adopted this Global Code of Conduct for research in resource-poor settings. The code is specifically written to try and focus on ethics dumping, which is a term that has been given to the export of unethical practices from high income to lower income countries. And it's a wonderful code with 4 values and 23 associated articles or statements. All of these are available on our website, but I've also included links in the slides for you to be able to access them directly online. And then something that might be helpful to both students and academics in our environment is a first of its kind attempt to outline what constitutes ethical and legal self-plagiarism with some examples. So when is self-plagiarism okay? I mean, often referred to text recycling. As academics, we may use some of our own work in some of our future work, and these guidelines offer researchers rules for recycling text in an ethical and legal way. So I'm just including this one slide on the text recycling research project, which has some wonderful resources for researchers, for editors, for students, all on text recycling and, how much of that can you do before it starts bordering on plagiarism. So these are very helpful and practical resources that one might want to bring into your environment. And then lastly, in the guideline section, just to bring your attention to the ICMJE guideline. I think the latest version is 2019, but essentially these are recommendations for authorship and publishing. And they lay out a number of criteria for how one meets authorship, as well as authorship requirements, as well as for helping authors on multi-author publications decide on ordering of those authorship. Another way we can foster integrity in research is mentorship and supervision. And so this is one of the drivers that came out really strongly in many of the studies that I evaluated. And there's a push now for improving supervision of postgraduates towards responsible conduct of research, because we see this as a weak area. Again, stats from the National Institute of Health, in over 50% of their findings of research misconduct, respondents were postdocs, students, technicians, and research assistants. And that doesn't mean that this is a bad group of people. It just means perhaps we're not supervising and mentoring our early career academics into the responsible conduct of research and into operating with research integrity. So this really needs a focus. In our Stellenbosch University research ethics policy, which was revised last year and approved by Council in November, we have brought some of this stronger language in that focuses on mentorship and supervision. So outlining that supervisors and mentors should be responsible for mentoring their students in and modeling to their students responsible research practices. So this includes obviously familiarity with and adherence to guidelines and standards and regulations, but also familiarity with and adherence to the processes, the research ethics processes and requirements of Stellenbosch University's research ethics committees. And then the final, as we've discussed already, way of fostering integrity in research is creating a healthy publication climate. So, we want to incentivize researchers to optimize quality and integrity rather than quantity. And then coming out of those Hong Kong principles, this group, and again, this is one of the studies that came out of Lex Botus unit, as an example of how to apply those Hong Kong principles in assessing the advancement of researchers. So we're not going to ignore the numbers. Here's a model that shows we don't have to throw the baby out with the bathwater. We don't have to ignore the numbers of publications and supervision, etc., but we can bring in some of these more qualitative evaluations and use both of them to evaluate progress. I'm going to move briefly now to the Stellenbosch University structures, policies, and procedures relevant to research integrity and ethics. And so I think I just wanted to start with a broad outline of the structures that support the promotion of responsible research at Stellenbosch University. And if we look on the academic side, obviously we have reporting to Senate, our Senate Research Ethics Committee, and this is an oversight committee for the ethics space. And we have 5 ethics committees at our university. The REC SBE, which is a social, behavioral, and educational research ethics committee. The REC ACU, which is an animal care and use ethics committee. The REC BES, which is an ethics committee for biological and environmental safety. And then HREC 1 and 2, which are health research ethics committees. And each of these 5 ethics committees serves all of the faculties of the university. It's centralized, and they each report to the Senate REC, as well as they report to the National Health Research Ethics Council. And then at the Division for Research Development, we have our Senior Director for Research and Innovation, and then a Director of the Office for Research Integrity and Ethics. We have 3 research integrity officers, and then research ethics administration, both on the Stellenbosch campus and on Tygerberg campus. So just a brief glimpse of our team. This is the team on the Stellenbosch campus. This is how you can contact us or where you can come and find us. And this small team is responsible for research integrity matters for the REC ACU, REC BES, and REC SBE. And then on the Tygerberg campus, we have a team, and this is how you can contact us. This team is responsible for the 2 HRECs and an undergraduate research ethics committee, which is a subcommittee of the HRECs. And then just down to policies. So there are 5 key documents that support research ethics and integrity at Stellenbosch University. The first is Stellenbosch University's research policy. And then we also have a policy for responsible research conduct, or the research ethics policy. And this is the one that was revised and approved by Council in November last year. Related to that policy for responsible research conduct, we have a procedure for investigating allegations of breaches. And then we have a plagiarism policy, and related to that, a procedure for the investigation and management of allegations of plagiarism. These are all available through the DRD website, and I've provided a link at the bottom where you can get access to these policies and procedures. And then maybe just to briefly touch on how does Stellenbosch University support research integrity. And we try to do this in 2 ways. And the first is to try and promote and foster it. And the second is to obviously respond to cases of research misconduct or breaches. But promoting and fostering research integrity and the responsible conduct of research is really our focus. And we provide advice and support at all stages for all aspects of the research process. We provide training, and obviously we have oversight of policy and guideline development in the space of research ethics and integrity. And then when there are allegations of research misconduct or breaches of research norms, we will respond to those by applying the policy and procedure. So I think, what I wanted to just do in this slide is outline what Stellenbosch University considers breaches of research norms at the institution. And in addition to the traditional fabrication, falsification, and plagiarism, Stellenbosch recognizes a number of what we outlined earlier as questionable research practices as breaches of research norms and standards. So these would include failing to follow accepted research procedures, breach of responsibilities for avoiding harm, breach of principles for handling private or privileged information, improper management of research funds or other resources, improper allocation of authorship, and in general, a failure to comply with national, statutory, professional, or legal requirements. And if there are breaches of research norms at Stellenbosch University, there is a official procedure which begins with the reception of a formal complaint in writing to the research integrity officer. However, I do want to emphasize that this is really a last resort because it's a very centralized process. And once you escalate a complaint through that central complaint process, it can transform something that might have been a simple dispute into something far more sinister. And I think in most cases, in my experience, much can be achieved prior to this at the departmental or faculty level. The key is always communication with all involved parties. So our office is here to advise, to discuss, to help you find a way through to resolution. And if it does require escalation, the central process has a set format according to the procedure, which includes protection of identity, and then the appointment of a formal investigation committee, which is senior academics, who then produce a report with recommendations, and the decision or outcome of that investigation is final. So I wanted to end off with just a couple of contact us slides. Please do, get in touch with us for general information and guidelines. You can see our website. On both the DRD website and the HREC website, there are a host of various resources for each of the ethics committees, training videos, training manuals, presentations, and FAQs. So please visit our websites and check out the resources that are there for you. And, we're here to help. So if you have any questions about the ethical design of your protocol, any questions about the responsible conduct of research, please get in touch with us. I want to stop there and thank you for your attention, and then open the floor for questions or comments and say, let's chat about research integrity and the responsible conduct of research.
Thank you, Nicola.
Okay.
There's a lot of applause for you in the chat, so that's great. And Karina is saying thank you very much. We just had one question from Karina. You probably saw there's some activity in the chat, but it's just she just wanted to know whether we have a formal research ethics policy or guideline, or whether it's more decentralized to the recs or faculties. Karina, I see you there.
Yeah.
Please go ahead if you want to share your question live.
If I can just give a bit of context, Dr. Barsdorf, I was looking at, for example, the first document that comes up off the website on that list of documents that you have. And I've recently been looking into some policies for Sustainable Development Annual Report. And I just wonder, it seems that it's from 1999. Is that the last time we actually reviewed that documentation, just to get an idea of, or what is the document rather than that I should look at that was approved by council last year?
That's the policy for the responsible conduct of research. So you'll see that will be a 2022 dated one, and that's the one that applies mostly to research integrity and ethics and how you can bring that into your work. Yeah.
Okay. But thank you so much for making it easily accessible.
It's a pleasure.
Yeah.
Thank you, Karina. There's no other questions in the chat. Just Ms. Marie is saying thank you for an informative session. Anyone else wants to raise their question live? You can use the raise hand function, or you can post your comment in the chat.
No.
None from what I can see.
Okay. That's
Oh,
great.
wait,
Oh, there we go.
Miss Linda Schlabeni. Please go ahead if you can put your camera on if you so choose to, or you can just raise your question live.
I'll just raise my question, please. I am based at Takeaway campus, and I'm a student at Stellenbosch campus. My participants are at my base, Takeaway campus. Now, it seems as if I cannot get the clarity I would really like to have. Where do I actually belong in terms of whom to contact? Is it the Stellenbosch campus in terms of research, or is it then which campus of the two will be able to help me about my participants?
Yeah.
It is clear to me that I have to contact the department, which is a Tygerberg campus. It seems as if there's something that I'm always missing. I'm not quite sure what is it that I'm missing.
I guess just to ask a question, are you asking which ethics committee you need to apply to for your research? Is that your question?
Yes, please.
Okay, so it's because our ethics committees are central, they don't serve a particular faculty. It really depends on what the content or the nature of your research is. So if you are conducting health research, then you would approach one of those ATREC committees, and the office that would be able to provide you support is on the Tygerberg campus. If you are conducting social science research that is not health research, then you can apply to the REC SBE, and that contact person would be Clarissa, who's on the line with us today. Does that help?
Partly it helps me. The part that I would like to you to please help me clarify is the fact that the nursing students that I am using are at Tygerberg campus, and I should contact that department as well. So where does that leave me?
Did you want to say something, Clarissa? I see
Oh,
you.
yes. Thank you so much. Miss Linda, I'm not sure if sorry, there, I'm appearing now. In addition to what Dr. Barsdorf mentioned, I just wanted to add that, so if you are conducting research at any of the SU campuses, so if you are your target population, it's SU students or staff, then in addition to applying for research ethics review and approval, you also need to remember that you have to apply to the SU Division for Information Governance, to get permission to actually recruit SU persons. I'm not sure if that is the additional step that you think you might be missing or not, but I added their details in the chat for you.
Thank you very much. Thanks a lot. That
Thank you,
helps me quite a bit. Thanks.
Oh, sorry, Nicola. There's another question for you from Wendy McCallum, and that is, thanks for the presentation, much appreciated. Could you please explain, I suppose, salami slicing in more detail and how this relates to students doing PhD by publication?
Yeah, so salami slicing is an interesting term, but it sounds just like, it is just what it sounds like. Slicing your publications inappropriately into the smallest possible pieces that you can, so that you can maximize the quantity of the publications that come out of a particular project. So how that relates to PhDs by publication, of course, one understands that in many research projects, whether they're large collaborative projects or a PhD by publication, there are appropriate instances where one will have multiple publications that come out of one study. and they are divided into appropriate chunks of content. And so the salami slicing is really when a researcher or an academic takes this idea of getting the maximum number of publications out of one study to the extreme and slices it up into tiny little pieces and publishes each little piece separately. So yeah, no, there's nothing wrong with doing a PhD by publication and having multiple publications coming out of that one study, as long as they're appropriately, sort of chunked up, and most PhDs will do that. Does that help clarify? Yeah, okay, good. Linda, is your hand raised again, or is that an old hand?
No, thank you very much. Sorry, I'm going to take care of that.
And anyone else? Otherwise, I can just reiterate, please, if you have questions and you want to follow up and you perhaps don't want to do it in this space, you are welcome to send us an email, and we can assist you in that way. Okay.
Just to confirm, Nicola, I don't see any other hands raised, nor any additional comments or questions in the chat.
Thank you, Clarissa. I think it's a wrap then. I want to thank everyone for your attention and for giving me time to talk about research integrity and ethics at SU.